Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And for those of you who are new to this thing, welcome. We're working our way through the book of Matthew a little bit every weekday. We've been working on this project for a very long time. And if you've been hanging out with me at all, you've figured out that I have kind of a weird obsession with the Pharisees, the sort of tragic bad guy character in the Gospels, and particularly in the Gospel of Matthew. And you might at some point be like, well, what is that about? Why do you spend so much time talking about these guys? And I got to thinking about that after the last couple of episodes. And I think the reason that I like to talk about them so much and that I like to try to think about the story from their perspective is because I think I can relate to them more than I can relate to Jesus. Now, before you turn the thing off and you're like, I had always thought that you were an absolutely horrible Christian, and now I know that for sure. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're better. Jesus is obviously the character I aspire to. He looks great in this text. All of his decisions are right. His judgments are correct. He keeps his cool. He's not a manipulative weasel. Everybody else weasels at different times throughout the document. He's spectacular. If you gave me one time travel token for all of history that I could only use on one thing, I would forego so many opportunities to be unbelievably rich, Biff from Back to the Future style, and I would instead use it because I want to be in the physical presence of someone this incredible. I would use it to go and hang out with Jesus and get a sense of what it was actually like to be around him. I'm in awe of this character, fascinated by this character. And if I'm to turn over all my cards here, I've vested the hope for my soul in this character. He's so different. And when you take a minute to really think about how he comes off in these different passages that we're looking at, the more you think about it, the more you get the initial crowd reaction to him after his first big public speech, the first of the 5 big speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured, that first speech being the Sermon on the Mount. I've said it 100 times, but you get to the end of that, and all of the people were like, whoa, that was awesome. That's incredible, because he speaks as one who has actual authority and not as our teachers of the law or the Pharisees, the religious ruling class who play out as the foil to Jesus. So please hear me. I don't want to relate to them more. I want to be other too. I want to always know what to do, and I want to have impeccable character. Then I'd love to be so incredibly good and righteous that I could even just give away my righteousness to other people. It'd be amazing to be that great, but I'm not. My motives are super flawed. I mean, sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're trash. Most of the time, they're not very carefully thought through, and they're just kind of slipshod and just whatever they are, I guess. And the Pharisees seem like that so often. I mean, sometimes they're really, really calculating. And it's like they got this grand strategy and they know what they're going to do. And they usually end up getting embarrassed when they have a grand strategy and try to pull the thing off. I can relate to that very well. Then other times you get through to the heart and you can see their insecurities and their weakness. And other times yet, like at the end of chapter 22, which we looked at a whole bunch after Jesus asked the questions about Psalm 110 and who do you say that Christ is? You get to the end of chapter 22 and it's like, they know. They know they're wrong. They don't even believe exactly what they're saying. They've just painted themselves into this corner. And so when we get to chapter 23 and we're looking at the passages that we've been looking at for the last week or so here, where Jesus pivots into a very public, humiliating rebuke of these religious leaders, for me, it's both cathartic because Jesus is calling out everything that's wrong. He is burning down, taking to task the establishment that has screwed everything up. But also, maybe kid me would have been real triumphalist in reading this for the first time, but right now me is a little bit more like, oh man, but I see the heart and the maybe even well-intentioned stubbornness of some of those Pharisees who are standing right there. And I can even picture what it's like for them to be raised in an environment where knowing the answers and saying the right thing and being real smart and doing what's right is what gets you approval, and everybody wants approval, and then they all fuel the system where they can all give each other this mutual approval, and they all feel good all the time because it's the only way they know how to feel good, and now they're getting called out in front of everybody. Their whole identity is being burned down. And I think Jesus genuinely cared about these people. I think he genuinely practiced what he preached back in the Sermon on the Mount, even though in chapter 23 here he says the Pharisees don't practice what they preach. Back in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, love your enemies. I think he has been loving to his enemies. I think he has treated the Pharisees with dignity and respect. He's also treated very important consequential ideas like they are very important consequential ideas. And now it's come to this. And we're going to hear that regret at the end of this difficult exchange when we get into the very end of chapter 23. And Jesus says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you. How often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you weren't willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you won't see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" There's regret there. There's disappointment and sorrow over what he just had to say in front of everyone. That was not the outcome that was the ideal. I mean, I guess he knew that's the way it was going to play, but you sure don't get the sense that he's reveling in or taking pleasure in exposing these guys up front. Well, to round out the last little details worth of stuff here that we were talking about on this topic yesterday, Jesus talks about how they present themselves and how they use cultural meaning to puff themselves up, how they do spiritual things not in the way that he advocated for in the Sermon on the Mount. Go and pray in private, do your giving in private, don't even let your other hand know what the one hand is doing when you're giving away things that you're supposed to be giving away. And so he's calling it out when he says this in 23:5. "Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have men call them rabbi." What he's describing here is a system. I don't think what you have here is a situation where every single Pharisee presents their phylacteries in a way that are overly dramatic. I'm not sure every single one has dramatic tassels. I'm not sure every single one is an arrogant cuss who boasts about things and struts around. I get the sense that Glenn, who we met in the last chapter, especially when we go over and look at the corresponding account in Mark chapter 12, I get the sense that Glenn, who asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" that he really wanted to know, but he was a humble dude and that he cared about things that were true more than he cared about his team. I think that Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus under cover of darkness in chapter 3 and sincerely asks questions of him, I think he cared about what was true. I think it was really important to him that he would not miss out on the Messiah. Now, I think what Jesus is doing here is not saying every single Pharisee is exactly the same and has all of the exact same motivations. Some of that is going to apply to several of these dudes. I think what he's describing first and foremost and critiquing is this thing they've built, this weird culture that was maybe nobody's fault, but it just kind of happened. And now it's out there and it's gross. And it's a system that when people get into it, it produces gross things in them too. And even though on paper, a whole lot of it might sound like God things, the actual manifestation of it doesn't look like that. And I don't know how many of you actually go to church or are even Christians. I know there are a ton of you who listen to this who would certainly say that you're not Christians or religious in any way. Maybe a lot of you at some point or another have gone to church, and maybe at times you've been around it and you're like, wow, the person leading this thing, they mean it. And the vibe of this whole place, it feels like it's in keeping with the point, the thrust of the Bible and who Jesus is presented as being, what God is doing redemptively. And maybe you've also been to church or something that has a Christian label slapped on it. And you're like, man, on paper, that sounds Bible-ish, but there's something about it in execution. It feels like the manifestations here of these ideas are not reflective of the things that are Christianity, and maybe it just feels off, like a brand mismatch or whatever. To me, it feels like that's what Jesus is calling out here. You guys gradually over generations uncritically built a thing that just happened to, through a bajillion little decisions, always lean toward propping you up and always lean toward not meeting the needs of people. And even if it was like 51-49 in terms of how you distributed your resources and all of those little decisions you've faced for decades and decades, it's still added up to something that is skewed and that is weird over the long haul. And Jesus is bold enough to walk into the headquarters of the whole thing and say, this just is no longer representative of the thing that you say you're trying to represent. This isn't what the kingdom looks like. And the passage we've been looking at for the last couple of days puts us right in the middle of some examples that he could point to that would have resonated with the original audience, but then understandably are a little more difficult for us to track with from a distance because we didn't live then and we didn't see it. And he's doing more here than just critiquing the bad behavior or bad motives of a few of these people. He is calling out the system that those little motives, even if they were unintentional, have gradually built. And he's playing the role of the prophet, trying to call people back to the thing that is true. Remember, the first words of Jesus' message were repent, turn in the opposite direction, change what you're doing, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he's still absolutely on message here, even though for these guys he's criticizing, it would have been so difficult for them to hear it because they're like, look at what we've written down on paper. Theoretically, everything we're doing here is super, super, super godly and religious and right. And Jesus is saying, yeah, and look at the fruit. You don't produce any, like that fig tree doesn't produce any. And so you can say right words all you want, but this is simply not reflective of the redemptive work of God, and it needs to change. And so if I say I find the Pharisees to be relatable in this way, that means that I guess that critique is something I need to find to be relatable as well. And so I'm kind of in a phase as I'm working through this with you where very genuinely I'm grappling with, how am I contributing to this right now? How are my insecurities and weirdnesses, and how is me doing a thing on the internet like what we're doing together here? In what ways am I contributing to things that look like the values of the kingdom, which are true and real and beautiful and transcendent, and I want that? And in which ways might my flaws and my insecurities and my quirks and my other stuff contribute to some of the things that on paper sound like kingdomy stuff, but in execution, I don't know. So I'm in that reflective place. You can join me there if you feel like it, or we can just have fun and do a podcast together, and we can get on to the next passage tomorrow, which we are going to do. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.